Welcome to the Dark Academicals, the podcast where we delve into the mythos of dark academia, one book at a time. I'm Sophie Waters.
And I'm Sarah Purnell. Before we launch into the novels themselves, we're going to ask, what is dark academia? How do we define a dark academia book, while also considering broader categories and books we consider dark academia adjacent? We're also going to look at the seminal texts, and these are the books that started it all, plus the classic and ancient texts that help inform the genre. We'll also recognise the criticisms surrounding dark academia, and finally we'll discuss our aims and goals with the Dark Academicals podcast.
It's really difficult to pin down a definition of dark academia as a literary genre, I think, because recently it's kind of become a bit of more of an aesthetic than a literary genre.
Yeah, I think at the minute it's not particularly recognised anywhere really, other than people who know of the aesthetic or have read and liked that kind of book, and then they found that it kind of falls into this category of dark academia.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like a subculture in that way, which I think actually fits with the origins and with the vibes of dark academia, because it has influences from the 50s, it has influences from Shakespeare and from ancient times. It's kind of a cumulative genre that's dumped everything together. But trusty old Wikipedia states dark academia as a social media aesthetic and subculture concerned with higher education, writing poetry, the arts, and classic Greek and Gothic architecture. The subculture is associated with ancient art and classic literature. And I find it really interesting that definition puts social media at the front of that definition rather than literature, which was my introduction to it, and I think yours as well.
Yeah. I think I only kind of became more aware of it as an aesthetic on social media because I was already interested in it from reading books like The Secret History.
Definitely. And I think over the course of the last couple of years and throughout the pandemic, it's taken on its own life on social media in a way that it wasn't present before than other in those pockets of literature.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that it took off during lockdown specifically. I think it found a good home in younger audiences from people who were facing long periods of isolation, their education was disrupted, and this hyper focus, almost like aggressive focus on online learning, and everything's online and it's all technology focused. It's almost like a rebellion to be more interested in something that's often considered a dead subject or a dead language.
Yeah, and I think also the consistent and the endless devaluing of arts by our government, by people who are in charge of university courses and people who are in charge of giving people these jobs and funding this sector. Young people are living in the height of their passion projects being undervalued and cut continually.
To say it's something that's just been brewing for a long, long time, because even when I was at school and doing A levels and stuff, my school, my sixth form and my secondary school moved from being, I can't remember what it was, but it turned into a technology college. And so then when I was picking my A levels, there was a big emphasis on taking a route that would lead you in a science or a technology subjects rather than opting for the arts or English literature or a language.
Yeah, my sixth form was the same. It was sports and science, but it also had a really strong academic background, and I could never understand how those two meshed in one place.
Yeah.
So I think part of my choice of a university, which was, famous for its creative writing programs, particularly its creative writing for young people program, it was such a nourishing environment for the arts. And I almost think it kind of shaped a bad example of how the world feels about literature, because once you leave university, the rest of the world isn't like that.
No.
And I think dark academia kind of gives that space to kind of call back to the power of language and art and creation in a way that our society doesn't respect or allow in that space unless you are of a certain demographic.
Yeah. I mean, we're going to look at a timeline for Dark Academia. So we've got the release of The Secret History in 1992. And I haven't looked at the numbers, but I feel like that if you compared that against like declining funding in arts, it would just marry. I think it would match up.
Yeah, I agree. And obviously, Secret History is set in America in the 80s. Donna Tartt herself was reflecting on her time at a small elite humanities university, but they don't really exist in that way anymore, especially in the UK.
No, and I think as well the 90s was the beginning of the internet. It was the beginning of online cultures, which have, for the most part, not been particularly kind to subjects like English literature or studying classics or any kind of creative. If it's not digital, then it's not worthy.
And I think that's probably one of the reasons why millennials have that attachment to Dark Academia, because it's a nostalgic and romantic view of a time when there was value in it and there was funding, and Gen Z kind of almost are taking on that nostalgia for a time they never knew.
Yeah.
Because they want it to be like that, and hopefully like the power of that will evoke some change when, you know, when these kids are old enough to vote, when they're old enough to have that social say in how their society and education is run.
I mean, on the flip side, social media for Dark Academia, TikTok has been pivotal, I think, for its explosion. I think TikTok, helped by Pinterest and Instagram, but I don't know, it's just a strange combination of media for something like, again, like even if we're not talking about Secret History, but we're looking at an older text or, you know, something like Sophocles, but it can somehow find a home of people on an app that got popular for doing dances. Like, it's just a very strange coming together.
But I also think that in the TikTok space, it's not so much about the books, it's about the aesthetic. It's about the moody dark browns and the blazers and the high neck tops, I don't know what they're called, and the the skull on the desk.
Yeah, I mean,
and it's that more than the books. So you get people talking about books like The Secret History, but you don't get a depth to those explorations.
I think that's the difference. You've got on the one side, you've got people who are enamored with the aesthetic, and then you've got people who are enamored with the books, and you can be both, of course, but I think there's a preconception that you can't be one without the other. So if you're absolutely interested in Dark Academia, then you obviously must dress in a muted colour palette, that, you know, you'd rather be living in a musty library and curled up in a old leather chair in a corner somewhere, being a bit morose and having an existential crisis. You know.
Yeah, I think it plays into that aspirational personality, rather than something that I read in Dark Academia is the power of education and learning, and the joy and the freedom and the possibilities in that.
Yeah.
The promise of change and of new futures and ideas and experiences. And I think that sometimes gets lost in translation in the new media approach to it.
Yeah, I agree.
think because that's where it sits for me. And it is also a kind of a development from the campus novel, which was popular in the 50s, and since then as well. So Stoner by John Williams, Prep by Curtis Sittenfeld, which is one of my favourite novels, and some people even class Normal People by Sally Rooney as a campus novel. which I think is really interesting because it doesn't fit my idea of a campus novel, but I can also see it.
Yeah, there is something really alluring about that, about the campus novel, but also about just generally being at university or being at college, because it is that pivotal moment as you as an adult coming into your own and discovering on your own what you like and your people. I think that's what I like about Dark Academia is it feels like regardless of how horrible the characters might turn out to be, it still feels like you've kind of found your people. These are people that champion learning and liking these things that aren't encouraged.
Yeah, but there's also an elitism in that
Yeah,
for sure.
that's definitely
It's very
one of the
exclusionary.
criticisms.
Yeah, it's very. I mean, even in the media aspect, it's very white, thin, middle class, cis women usually or
Yeah,
girls. That's the kind of that's what you'd get from the genre if you only knew it from the media side, and
yeah,
if you knew it from the literary side, it would be all of those things but men and rich.
yeah.
So it's very kind of, there's a real lack of racial diversity,
Mm.
and homosexuality and gender diversity is suppressed and it's never celebrated and often fetishized actually.
Yeah,
And that's something we're definitely going to end up talking about a lot
yeah,
with The Secret History, and some of the other titles we've got coming up. It's this traditional set of privileged attributes in an elitist and expensive situation, and it kind of says that actually if you like literature and classics, this is the only option for you. Like if you don't go to Oxbridge or an Ivy League school, are you really interested in classics? Do you really like Shakespeare that much? Because that's what's expected of that type
yeah,
of interest. That's where that's supposed to go.
yeah,
And I think as well, like in the novels, like students that have scholarships or are working alongside their education to pay for this, to be part of this club, it's almost scorned because they're working for this opportunity that's been handed to these other characters because they feel they are entitled to it, and it's often pushed to the side, and or they actively try and hide it, like Richard Papin in Secret History.
yeah,
He doesn't tell anyone. Everyone assumes he's rich. Doesn't he say he's like from oil money or something?
yeah,
And it's that kind of assumed prejudice almost against someone without money, because lots of these very conservative ideas of people at these elite universities are like, well, if you don't have the money to be here, should you be here? And usually, and there's a quote from A Secret History, which for me, I think encapsulates Dark Academia and the valid criticisms of it as well. It's it is better to know one book intimately than 100 superficially. That kind of encapsulates the elitism and the pursuit of intense knowledge of one subject. It's a narrow world and a hyper focus on one area of study or an author or a novel that all of the characters in the story revolve around, to the exclusion of everything and everyone else. And that also projects onto the type of characters and people that are allowed that hyper focus, because they don't have to worry about being employable. They don't have to worry about having something concrete to fall back on after they leave this bubble. And it's that putting something on a pedestal and revering it to beyond its worth and to the detriment of everything else. So I think that very short sentence in The Secret History kind of covers everything about Dark Academia. And all of those criticisms are what make it interesting and worth talking about.
yeah, I agree. There are certain elements that I think you can pick out of a Dark Academia title that makes kind of it more easy to spot one. Like, I know usually when you pick up a Dark Academia title, you just know. But then when you're trying to explain to someone what it is about that book that makes it Dark Academia, I think I've got a few bullet points of like elements that I think are important. And you don't have to have all of these elements, but I think that they need at least maybe 3 or 4 for it to kind of ring true as Dark Academia. And the first one,
literary signposts, kind of things. Yeah,
and I think the first one is definitely a higher education setting. I think the setting on campus is usually very elite or exclusive in some way. I don't know, can you have Dark Academia without it being set at least partly on campus?
To me, that wouldn't be Dark Academia, I don't think. And those settings are often quite isolated as well, which I think compounds the atmosphere, doesn't it?
I think also I've put old Gothic architecture. Not necessarily, it doesn't have to be old and Gothic, but again, I think that adds to the mood of the book, and it kind of imposes on the characters too. I really enjoy it when a setting kind of becomes a character in itself.
Yeah, and it almost has a weight on the characters, doesn't it? Like the history and the kind of level of acclaim of this institution, that kind of, it physically hangs over the characters, doesn't it?
Yeah. Also a preoccupation with classical studies, so Latin, Greek, classic literature, philosophy. I think you probably can have a Dark Academia book without the characters, but usually they've got one kind of obsession, whether it even be for music or for art. There is some kind of creative or classic subject or author or individual obsession, I think.
Yeah, there's that focus that is like the heart of their academic life, isn't there?
Yeah. This one's really simple. Murder.
There's always a murder.
There's been a murder. That was my terrible Taggart impression. But yeah, I think again you can have Dark Academia without there being a murder or a death or some kind of tragedy, but I think that kind of event happening can either compound or create this existential crisis that they then have to pick through in their current selves, like about their present life through the death, usually of someone else.
Yeah, usually being the cause of said death.
Yeah. Shh, spoilers.
As we said, they're not great people.
I put a dark, moody and or haunting vibe, but I think a lot of that is created by the other elements. But I think there's usually something in the writing, isn't there, that's quite not necessarily solemn or morose, or I don't know. There's a vibe.
Yeah, it's almost like a lyricism to it in that way of old Gothic texts, isn't there?
Yeah, definitely.
Like, when you read a classic Gothic novel, you only need to read a few paragraphs to know that you are reading a Gothic novel.
That's true.
And I think it's the same with Dark Academia for me.
I put hero worship of a particular figure or author, like I mentioned with the preoccupation with classical studies, but I think this is more specific in that it could be, I mean, in the Secret History, they're obsessed with like this bacchanal, this Dionysian rite ritual, but it's usually someone like Shakespeare or Plato or someone like that they've kind of got this particular figure that they're almost obsessed with in a scary way. And then I've put old money, which will collide with new money or no money. I mean, whether it's blatant and in your face or it's just the fact that you've got someone who, usually it's someone who has come from not a lot, coming up against people that have kind of had everything handed to them on a silver platter, and the juxtaposition of that. And one of my favourite things is weather as a literary device. Like, I love it when there's weather.
You just like weather.
I love the weather. No, but it could be, I think it immediately changes a scene or a mood, or it can change like a character's direction or what happens, and I just enjoy the weather.
Yeah, fair. Pathetic fallacy. Anyone who's done GCSE English in the UK, that is embedded in your brain.
Yeah. And then underdeveloped social skills, or the protagonist is portrayed as an outsider. So usually our protagonist is a little bit awkward. They don't quite fit in for one reason or another. Usually that's because they don't have any money. And they are that. I mean, they could be you. I mean, I think that's what I always think when I'm reading it. The protagonist could be you. Like, it could be me. I'm not saying I'd want it to be, but it could be.
I think that kind of allows for you to project yourself onto that character, doesn't it? And that, I wonder if that's why these novels are so all-encompassing.
Yeah.
Because there is room for you to put yourself into this story, isn't there?
Yeah.
Or these stories.
I think as someone that really, I mean, by the time I got to university, I was glad of the decisions that I made. But there is always a part of me that kind of wishes that I could have gone to Oxford and studied something really pretentious. You know, like there is that little part of me that wishes that that could have been me. And I suppose I can relive that through Dark Academia.
It's because it's sold to you as the ultimate, isn't it?
Yeah.
There is no bigger or finer achievement than that. Even if actually that environment sounds horrifically toxic.
Yeah.
And I probably would have hated it. Whereas I loved university.
Same.
But if I was somewhere else, can't say I would have done. Because you never know, do you?
No, that's true.
I think that leads us on nicely to discussing a few of the seminal texts of Dark Academia. And these are going to be featured throughout the podcast. So we are just touching on them for now. First, in all discussions of Dark Academia, is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. It is the OG Dark Academia novel, and it was published in 1992, so it's 30 years old this year. Like me.
Wow.
Scary stuff.
It's just, so it's the one. Like, it's everything. It's the benchmark, isn't it, of Dark Academia?
And I think that's what Dark Academia novels are compared to. That's what they're set against. And you're kind of like your signposts of Dark Academia. They're all in there.
Yep.
I mean, it's a long book, so there's room. But they're all in there. So
it's even got my weather.
Quick overview. It has also got the weather. And the weather is actually a powerful part of that story. And it drives it along quite a lot, which is something we may talk about in the coming weeks. So, The Secret History is set in the 1980s, and Richard Papin from California, he weasels himself into Hampton College, a very elite university in New England, where he kind of falls in with a very exclusive group of students who are all under the influence of a very strange but charismatic classics professor, as they kind of go on to push the boundaries of morality, really, and kind of it changes all of their lives forever. This one class at university. That is going to be our first book, which we will be discussing in 2 weeks, and we've both read it before, and we're both very excited to revisit these psychos.
I mean, that classics professor needs to be put in prison for one.
Oh god, yeah. It's a miracle how he remained teaching, to be honest. But more on that in a couple of weeks.
I think then there's the other book that I think people always point to is If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. And that was published in 2017. So that is a huge gap between those two novels, and yet they are both seen as the benchmark. This one is again set at an elite college, but focusing on a Shakespeare drama programme. And you find out at the very beginning that Oliver Marks, who is our main character, has just served 10 years in prison for the murder of one of his closest friends, a murder that he may or may not have committed. And the book is going back, all very dramatic, and the book goes back to this young actor studying Shakespeare who gets very caught up in a interesting set of circumstances, and we find out what really happened, and it's fantastic. And it is eerily similar to The Secret History in a lot of ways, but it's also very different, so it's a really interesting comparison to The Secret History. And again, that will be, I think, our second or third for the podcast.
Well, I'm probably going to butcher his name because... So, my English lecturer at university swore down that this was how you pronounced Aeschylus's name. However, I have since looked it up on the internet, and we all know how reliable the internet is, but the internet tells me that it's Aeschylus, not Aeschylus. So, either way, he was a Greek dude. And he is known as the father of Greek tragedy. So I think it's he's got some of the oldest surviving Greek tragedy plays, figuring features such as Agamemnon and Clytemnestra and all those kind of good Greek myths. And then there's also Sophocles, who could have been Aeschylus's contemporary. They're not entirely sure, but it was either written during, they're at the same time or slightly after. So there's figures like Agamemnon and Ajax and Achilles, and I think those figures probably resonate quite well even today, especially with blokes for obvious reasons. There is a toxic masculinity element to a lot of Greek mythology, and I'm not entirely sure why people still want to pursue that as something for their own personality. I think there are, like a lot of plays, you can interpret them in different ways. But I think what happens within Dark Academia especially is that the characters seem to interpret things in ways that are quite destructive. So they take on the more negative aspects of a character rather than exploring it with an open mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah, they also take permission from those texts, don't
yes.
they? If they did it 2,000 years ago, it's totally fine. You're even if it's a myth, no, it's totally fine. It's all good.
And then, of course, we've got Mr. William Shakespeare.
Or Billy Shakes.
Oh, Billy Shakes.
Calls him.
And I think particularly plays like Hamlet or Othello, Titus Andronicus, I think those are the ones that would resonate more strongly in a Dark Academia setting than some others. Although, what's that book that's coming out?
You have to be more specific than that.
There is a title that's coming out, I'm sure it's this year, isn't it? Where she is a teacher doing something. All's Well. Is that what it's called? Does that sound familiar?
Award.
Yeah.
Mona Award. Yeah. Is that based on All's Well That Ends Well?
Yes.
College theatre director called Miranda Fitch. She is determined to put on Shakespeare's All's Well That Ends Well, and she faces a mutinous cast hell-bent on staging Macbeth instead. And then 3 strange benefactors who have a strange knowledge of Miranda's past and a tantalising promise for her future help her to put the play on, to the detriment to everyone who is involved in the production.
I doubt there'll be murder, though. Doesn't sound like there'll
be
murder.
Never know. You never know. Bunny was pretty weird. So, who knows?
But yeah, William Shakespeare obviously turns up time and time again, more often than the ancient Greek tragedians. And for good reason, because those plays, you could read them every which way and upside down and you would still find a different meaning within them.
Yeah, there's a lot to draw from and a lot to interpret, and I think part of that is the language as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which helps, and lots of kind of Dark Academia characters take on that language as almost a personality trait.
Yeah.
That comes up a lot in If We Were Villains.
So I think titles like All's Well, not necessarily Dark Academia, but what we might consider Dark Academia adjacent.
Yeah.
Which maybe we should try and explain what we mean by Dark Academia adjacent.
Yeah, definitely, because that is going to be a part of the podcast in the future.
Yeah. So I think there are some books that they have either informed Dark Academia in some way or had an influence on it, and I don't know, I find it's almost like a feeling for me personally. Yeah. A book feels like it should be Dark Academia, however it's not.
It's almost like they have another genre classification that's stronger.
Yeah.
So it falls under that instead, but it definitely has Dark Academia elements, like Piranesi by Suzanne Clarke.
Yes.
That is a magical realism novel, but it is also very much Dark Academia. And that is going to be one of the books that we explore as a Dark Academia adjacent novel. And we're also going to look at Light Academia.
Novels like The Great Gatsby, which I suppose on paper doesn't make sense as a Dark Academia novel. But if you've ever read The Great Gatsby, it's got the right mood, it's got the right tone. There are a lot of similar concerns and issues, like with the protagonist and how he's portrayed. And
yeah, definitely. And same with like The Picture of Dorian Gray.
Yeah.
And Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh and Maurice by Ian Forster. So these are all texts that we are going to examine under the Dark Academia lens and see how they fit and how they don't fit into this genre and how they kind of, I guess, accompany traditional Dark Academia texts, just to try and expand Dark Academia as a literary genre rather than just leaving it in its pigeonhole of an aesthetic.
I think that will lead us nicely on to talking more about the criticisms of Dark Academia. So what are some of the main criticisms of Dark Academia? I think the biggest clangor is the lack of racial diversity.
Absolutely, yeah. When we were doing our research and the planning for the podcast, we obviously wanted to make sure that our reading list was as diverse as possible. I mean, obviously because reading should be diverse, but also we were representing the genre as a whole. But we struggled to find any non-white written or led Dark Academia. The only one that I personally came across in my research was Ace of Spades, which is actually going to be a book in the first season of the Dark Academicals, so keep an eye out for that one. But beyond that, I struggle to find anything. And I do wonder if that's because of the way that the social media aesthetic and the history of Dark Academia is so exclusionary in that way.
Yeah. It's a very white space. And it's still, I mean, it's set in very kind of elitist and expensive educational settings, which are still, I mean, it's something that really winds me up, that it's still something that is just mainly only accessible if you're white.
Yeah, and that's kind of has rundown of institutional racism in the UK, doesn't it, really? That's a difficult one to grapple with, but one that we are going to kind of talk through and tackle with the books as we go through, because it's a big and an important topic that we will definitely continue to keep looking.
Yeah, and if anybody has any suggestions or recommendations that we can check out, then they will be gladly received.
And I think that kind of leads on nicely to the exclusionary nature of Dark Academia when it comes to sexuality.
Yeah,
because there is definitely a bias towards straight cis men and women as the main characters and the main focus of these novels.
Yeah, gender diversity is like non-existent.
Yeah, absolutely. Which, although it's not acceptable or right, you would expect from the older texts. but
Yeah.
continually surprises me with the more modern texts.
Yeah, same.
And again, and I think that has similar connotations to, is that its accessibility
Yeah.
and that kind of exclusionary space.
I think homosexuality or questions about sexuality are featured usually as that it's not featured in a way that's particularly celebrated or that would normalize just the way that someone presents themselves. It's
a mystery, it's a plot twist.
That's what I'm trying to get.
Scandal.
It's used as a plot twist, and that's not right.
No. And even when it is present, it's not an obvious, open sense of sexuality. It's, oh, they could be, are they? Oh.
Yeah.
And it's very fetishized in that way. That's definitely the case in The Secret History.
Yeah.
And we will definitely be looking into that, because that is a whole minefield in that book. But even in If We Were Villains too, and that's a modern novel. That was written in 2017, so I think that has a heavier weight to carry with that because of the time that was written in. And that kind of theme runs through a lot of the modern dark academia novels. There is also a gender issue in terms of the people that are at the forefront of these novels are usually men.
Yes, it is a male-dominated perspective.
But interestingly, most dark academia novels are written by women, and yet still the character focus is on men.
Is that a reflection of... Again, it's a poor reflection on these institutions that still... It's almost acceptable if you're male to go and study Latin. But if you're female, what are you doing?
Yeah. I guess it's the legacy of those people and those areas of study that are idolised.
Yeah.
Because as we've said, all of the Greeks, we only have surviving stuff from men. Presumably because the women weren't allowed to write.
Yeah, essentially.
Or weren't allowed to share their creativity in that way. And Shakespeare, very male-dominated.
Yeah. And
he was a man. So I do wonder if it's that reflection of the source material. Think of any examples of non kind of straight cis characters in Shakespeare at all.
Unless if you're watching Romeo and Juliet by Baz Luhrmann.
Yeah, oh god, I love that movie.
I feel like I can trace my queer awakening to that movie.
To that film.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the case with a lot of people.
Like, oh, this is how it is. Okay.
Seminal movie, that one.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I find that kind of that refusal to branch into those more open liberal spaces with the exploration of sex and sexuality and gender and race, like in an environment where these characters are pursuing knowledge and learning and growth. They don't want to be pushed outside of their little zone of learning. There's no space.
I mean, it's very Tory.
It is. It 100% is.
Yeah.
And that kind of... once you say that, you're like, well, it all makes sense now. What else do we have to say? It's conservative ideals while preaching liberalism, because they are in their little bubble where the people around them are the exact same as them and are compounding those views. Basically, in these dark academia worlds and settings, anything goes as long as you're all rich and straight and privileged and white and you all agree to cover for each other, because someone's got money to throw at it.
Yeah.
There's no room for mistakes outside of those remits. limits. There's a status quo. In the words of High School Musical, you must stick to the status quo. Or you will be punished and ostracised by your peers. And hopefully as we dig further into Dark Academia, we will hopefully see that being broken down a little bit with the more modern texts.
I hope
we've tried
so.
to kind of balance it. We've got the classics, we've got classics, and the newer novels that we're very much hoping are going to push those boundaries of what a Dark Academia novel is. So I suppose we should probably actually tell you a little bit about the Dark Academicals and how this whole show is going to go. We are going to be releasing a podcast episode every 2 weeks, and there will be 6 titles in each season. We will have a short little break to recover. Then we will be back with another 6 titles, one title every other week, and that is how we will continue. And we can reveal our first 6 titles. Ooh. If Sarah would like to do the honours.
So, we have, of course, The Secret History, and then we have If We Were Villains, Ace of Spades, Madam, The Great Gatsby, and Catherine House.
So, 6 novels where you've got the obvious Dark Academia, you've got the less obvious Dark Academia, and then you've got The Great Gatsby where I can fool you all going, huh? And that fits into our Dark Academia adjacent. I think we're gonna have one of those books in each kind of season of the podcast.
Books that make you go, huh?
Yeah, exactly. So that is how it's going to run. In each episode, what we're going to try and achieve is to explore how the text matches up with our definition of Dark Academia and how it also matches external ideas of what Dark Academia is, how it differs from both of those things. Obviously, our general thoughts, observations, likes, dislikes, all of those fun bits that bookworms like to talk about. We will have a little bit of an academic section where we'll analyse elements, whether that's themes, literary devices, settings, quotes, really dig into the text as far as we can. Use our university brains that have been put away for a while. And then we're also going to do a character close-up where we pick on a character, not necessarily the protagonist, but a character among the ensemble and kind of explore them more thoroughly as a character and their relation to Dark Academia. And we'll be doing that for every text in the podcast episodes.
Yes, we will.
So that's what you can expect from us in the upcoming episodes. Our first episode based on a novel will be The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which will be on your listening devices in 2 weeks' time, and we hope you'll come back for more. Thanks for listening.
Bye.